Recording begins. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another exciting masterclass at Advanced Course in Drones and Development. I really hope you've enjoyed so far. And today it's going to be more about practicality. How do you even conduct the business of drones? It could be anything. It could be manufacturing, it could be deployment, it could be operations, or it could be even support, or it could be social impact. It could be completely non-profit projects. It could be anything. It could be photography, videography, whatever you imagine your drone to do. But the more important thing that we would try to do in that is understand who are the stakeholders that we will be engaging with. So here we would try to maybe talk more about the humanitarian applications, because that's what flying labs are known for. And we would talk that in details in terms of understanding whom are we really working with, what is it that they really need, and how do you engage them? How do you make them interested in your projects, in your drones? Because we understand that drones are an emerging technology. They're all in the future. So to make people imagine what you are thinking and get them on your side, it's like a big challenge. So today we have Sonja Betschart from Switzerland. She's the co-founder of WeRobotics and one of the key mentors in the Flying Labs network. And she has been mentoring all the Flying Labs in understanding and elaborating their business propositions. So today she's here with us. Welcome, Sonja.
Thank you, Ruchi. I'm really, really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Over to you.
Thank you. Can I share my screen for my presentation?
Yes, please.
So I have some slides that I'd like to share with you. There we go. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Ruchi. So you already introduced me, so I don't have to do that. But still, before starting, I want to tell you a bit more about my story, where I come from, and then give you an introduction how we go to the next part, to the stakeholder part. So 10 years ago, I was working in conservation, doing conservation projects in Africa and in Latin America. And we would, for many of our projects, we would always miss geospatial data. We did conservation projects with species, with wildlife, and we had small budgets. And we could never afford to buy satellite data. And a lot of time, satellite data for the areas we worked in, which are very remote areas, were not really available either, latest updates. So we did without. But we were always missing a really important part, and a really important source of data for our projects. And 9 years ago, I came back to Switzerland and started working for a startup. So what many of you might not know is that the drone sector per se, the drone industry, or even better said, the civilian drone industry, is actually quite young. It's just about 9 years old. So when I came back to Switzerland, I looked for an exciting job opportunity, and I found one in a startup here in Switzerland of one of the first drone software companies who allowed to take drone imagery and turn that into maps and 3D models. The company is today a market leader. They're called Pix3D. And when I joined them, I was one of the first employees, and we were sitting in the garage and figuring out, where we can go with this. And before that, I didn't know about drones. But when I discovered what was possible, and that was the very beginning of the industry, I was so amazed, because I thought like, wow, if like just a year ago, I would have had access to these kind of technologies, it would have been a game changer for the work we did in conservation. We would have been able to create our own data. We would have been able to introduce this kind of data into our other data streams that we had and have a much bigger and fuller picture. And we would have been able to take so much better decisions. And it was not available. So for me, this was a great opportunity to say like, wow, I still can do my job. I was their head of marketing and business development. But on the side, let me team up with some friends and colleagues who were always also working in this very new industry, and let's go try it out doing projects. So naturally, my projects were about conservation. And then from 2013 to about 2015, we did about 15 projects also in conservation, trying out drones for a number of applications. And the photo you see here is actually in the Seychelles. where we were creating a base map for a very important habitat for shark and for ray breeding, and a habitat that is also heavily under pressure by seawater rise, which has many implications in this habitat. So doing projects like that, I learned a lot. And one thing I learned really was that possibly me traveling to the Seychelles or me traveling to Namibia or Tanzania was not needed, because there were many really, I would say, highly motivated and highly resourceful and highly better placed people than me locally, who could have done my job, who could have taken drones and made their own maps. But being myself in charge of business development for one of the drone companies, I also knew that our markets were not really the markets in Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia or the Pacific. Our markets were more the European market, the American market. So the outcome of that is that most people who actually would really profit of these technologies did not even know they existed 9 years ago. So our goal was then to say, okay, let's do something about this. Let's not just do projects. Let's actually create a bridge. Let's create a bridge between the industry and the technology and the knowledge that is already there about using these kind of new tools, together with the local experts in many, many countries who would like to take these tools and actually put them to good use. And this is how, together with my two co-founder colleagues, Patrick and Andrew, we decided to start WeRobotics just under 6 years ago. And it has been an amazing journey since, because we have come across so many inspiring and motivated and knowledgeable experts, local experts, just like Ruchi. This is how I get to meet Ruchi. And it's, for us, it's really a dream coming true. Seeing that the technologies that can make a difference are in the hands of local experts. Because again, me traveling, I can travel to the Seychelles, okay, that's not an issue. I can travel to Namibia and do projects, that's not an issue. But I miss all the local contextual information. I miss the local culture. I miss knowledge on the local stakeholders. And this is a theme we were going to talk about a bit later today. So this is where Flying Labs come in. And this is where Flying Labs really bridge that gap also locally to introduce these technologies, so drone and drone data technologies, to local stakeholders. That's kind of their main mandate. Now, in my last, it's not like last 9 years, but especially in the last 5 years, with the Flying Labs, I have learned two very, very important elements. And the first one is this one, that it's not about the robots, that it's not about the drones. So I know that the last 4 days you talked a lot about technology. So today we're not going to talk about technology, because in the end, it is not about the drones. So in my work that I did, in my project work, and looking at all the work that is done in Flying Labs and the projects that Flying Labs do, we kind of can say with much certainty that if you look at how time is spent, for example, for a project, how much time is actually spent with the drones. And that's about 10%, which is the smallest part. Again, it's what we talk about a lot, but in reality, that actually, spending time with drones is really the smallest part of our jobs. So where we spend most of our time with is, on the one side, if we use drones for mapping with the data, so processing the data, analyzing the data, sharing the data, that's about 45% of our time. And then the other 45% is about stakeholder engagement. So stakeholder engagement happens before a drone is ever flown, a lot, hopefully most of the time, and then during, and then also in the data phase. Because we like to say, what good does it do if you fly a drone and if you acquire data, if this data is not used, if this data is not turned into action, into a decision, into something that actually will have impact and make a difference. And this is why we spend so much time on stakeholder engagement. So this was a really important learning Again, like we talk so much about drones and about the technology because it's exciting. And that's also okay. But then I always need to remind myself also, in the end of the day, it's not about the drone. It is about the impact that the drone or the drone data actually can create. And this is what will make the difference and not the drone itself. An important learning I also made over the last 10 years, and also a bit before that, is this African saying that is our mantra at the Flying Labs Network and the WeRobotics, to say, alone, we can go fast. However, together, we will go far. Meaning that having a direct engagement and implication of stakeholders, of everyone who's actually going to be part of the outcomes, it takes time. It will sometimes slow down the process a bit because there have to be discussions, there has to be a lot of engagement, but it'll make a big difference because we might not go there fast, but we will go much further if we do it together. So combined between the first one saying, again, if we look at how much time that we spend in our work with engaging with stakeholders, and the fact to know that if you want to go somewhere, if you actually want to go far and make a difference and create an impact, it is never going to be alone. It is always going to be together. And that means we have to define, what does together mean? Who are the faces? Who are the people behind together? And this is the main part of my session today that I want to tackle with you, to look at the together and to look at stakeholders. So, like, what does stakeholders refer to? Stakeholders refers to people or to parties that have an interest in your work or in your project, and that your project or your work can affect or can be affected by the outcomes. So if you look at, for an example, primary stakeholders in a typical social good project like we do with the Flying Labs Network are, on the one hand, the project clients, on the other hand, the local communities, the beneficiaries, government services involved, and any other kind of party or group of people who are impacted by the project. And this includes, naturally, all the project partners. So when I refer to stakeholders in the next part of this session, this is who I talk about. Everyone that is affected by the project and is affected by the outcomes of the project or the work in general. I have divided my session on stakeholders into 3 parts: the why, the what, and the how. And what I'm going to talk about when we talk about stakeholder is actually how can we map our stakeholders. So why is it important to do stakeholder mapping? Why do we want to have a very clear view on who our stakeholders are? Now, this is essential for the success of our work and of your work on your projects. Because first and foremost, it will allow you to manage better the expectations of all the people and all the parties that are involved or influenced by your work. Everyone will have very different expectations. So to be able to align, to understand the expectations and to manage them, well, we have to know who, again, will be impacted directly or indirectly by the work. Stakeholder mapping is also very, very important because it allows for a certain kind of risk management. Meeting the stakeholders' requirements and keeping them happy will reduce the risk of project failure. So knowing from the very beginning, again, what their expectations are and what their requirements are and what will satisfy them in the end, possibly with the data, is a great way of managing the risk of a project. So for these 2 main reasons, stakeholder mapping should always be kind of the first thing that you think about when you start thinking about a project or your work before going into the details. Now, what is stakeholder mapping? It is something you will start, hopefully again, in the very beginning of your work or of your project, but it's not something that ends. It's a continuous process. You will start out with a first list, with a first map of your stakeholders, but as you go on in your project and as you evolve, this list will grow. Some might even drop off because you will see, no, actually, in the beginning we thought these would be stakeholders, but they're not. They might shift somewhere else. And very certainly, a good number will be added as you evolve throughout the project. So it's good to look at this, not something I do in the beginning and then I set it aside because it's done. This is something that is going to go on all throughout your work or all throughout your project. It definitely is a continuous process. Now, again, like, what will be the primary outcomes of mapping stakeholders? Essentially two things. First, a comprehensive list of the stakeholders involved with your project or with your work. So a list of parties, of group of peoples that you will have together. And second, an understanding of how you will interact with those stakeholders that are on your list. So looking at what stakeholder mapping is, on the one hand, it's a list of the stakeholders, and on the other hand, it's kind of an engagement strategy. How will you engage with those stakeholders and making yourself a plan? Now, this is easier said sometimes than done, but it's actually not very complicated, because essentially, to do stakeholder mapping, there are 3 key steps that you can follow. So it is not very, very complicated. And the first step is to generate a list of stakeholders. So we come back to what we said before. What you want to start out with is a list. Now, the best way to create a stakeholder list is not to just sit, by yourself in a corner and start thinking, but it's actually to brainstorm. Brainstorm together with your project team, even brainstorm together with some of your key stakeholders, who other stakeholders might be. So go out, talk to people, have brainstorming sessions on who are the stakeholders, and start generating a list. Once you're doing this list, you also can think about different types of stakeholders. Do not only just think about the core stakeholders or the direct stakeholders, also think about the indirect stakeholders, the ones who are indirectly impacted or influenced by the project outcomes. And by thinking about these kind of different types, your list might actually get longer. Not just say it's my main client and it's possibly the community or the beneficiary, but also say, okay, are there actually indirect stakeholders also here in play? So to think about these different types will allow you to grow your list bigger. And then once you have a nice list together, it's good to kind of try to find a first kind of logic to that. I call that to do like affinity grouping. Sometimes I had projects or programs where our list is very, very long. So, and how do you work with such a long list like this? Especially we brainstormed, in the project, but we also brainstormed again with some of the stakeholders, and then the list got very long. So then we tried to say okay, to make this manageable, can we group some of these stakeholders that we put on our list together? Do they have certain affinities that are the same? So possibly we can remove some of the duplicates that are in here, we just put other words to that, but essentially it is the same kind of type of stakeholder. Or can we group them together into kind of group of stakeholders? Because having a list that is manageable is going to help you with step number 2. So step number 1, brainstorm, go out. Again, think about, alone you will go fast, together you will go far. It applies everywhere. It applies here too. It might take a little bit more time, but the outcomes will be really good. And come out of that first step with a list that is possibly already grouped a little bit and is not too long. Because I had projects, when we were at this stage, we had a list of over 100 names. So we said yeah, this is not going to work. Let's group them and let's see if we can remove some of them because they're actually duplicates. Once you're here, you will go to the next step. The next step is to say, now that we have a list, let's map them. Let's map the stakeholders based on their characteristics. Now, depending on what you want to do, you might come up with your own characteristics, how you want to map them. The way I like to map my stakeholders is actually by only using 2 characteristics, because for me it has proven to be the easiest and most effective way of doing stakeholder mapping. And these 2 criteria or characteristics are influence and interest. So what I always like to do is to draw a square like here and kind of have the square divided into 4 parts, and to look at it, okay, you know, what is the level of influence this stakeholder has on my project? Does the stakeholder have a low influence on it or a high influence? Then once I kind of see, okay, it's going to be in the lower part and a higher part, then I ask myself the second question is like, how low or high, how important or not important is the interest of the stakeholder in my project or the project outcomes? To then say, you know, would I put this stakeholder in the left upper corner or in the right upper corner? So that when I take the list, at the end of step 2, all the stakeholders that we had in the list, and I do this a lot with Post-its, you know, put this on a flip chart, then just move them to one of these 4 quadrants. Again, based on influence and based on interest. So quite easy. Once this is mapped out, I actually have my stakeholder map. And that brings me to the second part that we discussed in the very beginning, to say, now that we know who the stakeholders are and where they kind of can be found in our universe, with this mapping of the stakeholders based on influence and interest, now I actually can create the strategy, how I will engage with these stakeholders. And in terms of strategy, it then means pretty much, you know, taking these 4 quadrants and saying, okay, what will I do with them? So, for example, the ones who, let's start with the ones who have high influence and high interest. So that's the one in the upper right corner. What I always like to do with them, but that's kind of a, not just me, it's kind of a universal good thing to do, is it's those stakeholders that you want to manage very closely, because they're the most important stakeholders for your work or for your project. Because again, why? Well, they have the highest interest, they also have a high influence. So they can influence the outcomes very drastically. So you want to closely engage and manage these stakeholders who fall into this category. And this can usually include, for example, clients or sponsors or decision takers and highly influential subject matter experts. Whenever possible, these stakeholders should be explicitly part of the project. If you can make them direct part of the project, you give yourself a very, very good chance that they're managed very closely and always up to date, and actually also get a feeling of ownership, because being part of the project will make them a project owner also, and they will be able to influence, they will be able to express their interest as they go, especially if they're part of the project team. Now, the second kind of group is the one on the corner that says high influence and low interest. So the upper left corner. The strategy for these kind of stakeholders there would be to keep them satisfied. So this group usually contains people with an important position who are not directly related to the project or to the work you do. So even though they are not directly involved with the project, they can exert a great deal of influence on it. So your team needs to engage with these stakeholders and understand and satisfy their needs. That's why I say keep them satisfied. Because when they are in alignment with the overall goal of the project and satisfied, they then can support it. They can exert their influence and be a great supporter of your project. Then let's look at the corner with low influence and high interest. That's the lower right corner. So the strategy there would be to keep them informed. You know, they're not going to be part of the project team possibly, otherwise they would be higher up. But you still want to keep the stakeholders informed, because they're a very good source of detailed information about your project. So it's really important to understand their needs and solicit their input. You also should stay aware of their perspective on the project. If you feel that they have concerns, or if they have concerns that are not addressed, they may actually engage more influential people, like the ones, possibly on the upper left or right side, and tell them, well, I have some issues or I have some concerns with this project. Keeping them informed on a continuous basis, checking in with them to see, what do they know about the project, keep them updated on that, and help them understand where you're standing. It's just going to make certain that, again, they give you feedback, which can be really important for you and for the project, but also that you can learn about their concerns. Now, the ones that you possibly will least engage with are the ones in the lower left corner, the ones who have low influence and low interest. So what's good to do with those stakeholders is just to have them here on your map. You possibly can monitor them, at once throughout like the project at halftime, saying like, we put this stakeholder here in this lower left corner, but I actually think it's more kind of be like the lower right corner, because as we advance throughout the project, we see that this person actually has shown interest. So let's move them. So that's why I say monitor means just think about them, come back to the map, look at it, ask yourself, as we advance, should we move there somewhere else? And then do that. Otherwise, there is no engagement, no direct engagement from your side actually needed with the stakeholders. It's just good, again, to have them here on the map. So as you can see, 3 quite easy steps for stakeholder engagement and for a stakeholder strategy. With this, I would like to open the floor for a discussion now for the remaining 15 to 20 minutes to learn from you. How have you done stakeholder engagement before? Do you have specific questions on elements I have walked you through in the last 20 minutes? And just to hear from you, your interest on stakeholder engagement. How do you do this,
Sonja?
Ruchi? Do you do this with the chat, or how do you do the Q&A session?
It depends upon how shy they are. So if, come on guys, you all can unmute yourself or just raise your hand, and if you want to, you can even use the chat. So Sonja, I have a question for you. Which are the most complicated or complex stakeholders that you have worked with, and how do you crack them?
Hi, so that's a very good question. It's actually a difficult question. So the complex ones are the ones who, for me, are the ones who say, I don't have interest, and are influential, but actually have a lot of interest. But the ones who kind of, when you talk to them or when you want to learn, they say like, yeah, just do, just keep me informed, but I really actually don't have interest, and then come back. Or even, not even directly with you, but sometimes with other stakeholders, voice their concerns or kind of, voice disagreement with the project. And so this for me has been difficult. I had stakeholders like this. It also comes back to the point, that this is a continuous process, and even the mapping is good to do on a continuous basis, because sometimes you can clearly see that they will move throughout the project. Because when you ask them in the beginning, or, you wouldn't ask them like, what is your level of interest? But in the discussion, it's like, yeah, no, this is, you can do it, but it's like really of no interest to me. But they still are very highly influential in many different ways in the country or in the sector. Then this has been the most challenging kind of position to do, because you have a project team, you have advanced, you're possibly half into the project. And then you kind of know, to be certain that we actually will get where we want to get, you need to include this party into the project already while you're quite a bit ahead. And sometimes you have to backtrack and rethink parts of the project again. because to satisfy also their needs or their concerns that they now speak out fully. So it is not easy because you have sometimes, you have always actually you have a limited budget, you'll have, a limited timeline also to get things done. So it's quite an art to balance between that and between still staying on track with the project outcomes, with the budget, and with the timeline. But what I have learned, if you ignore it, then this will have a huge impact on the success of your project. Because, so much effort and so much dedication and passion goes into the projects that for example, with Flying Labs work on. So then in the end, for such a project, not be reaping, I would say, the impact and the benefits that it can, just because of misalignment of, stakeholders and not taking them into account, is such a waste, because you'll have great outcomes, but nobody actually wants to touch them. So that is the most frustrating thing, and this has happened to me, but it's so frustrating. So that's why I have learned, while I would much rather spend my time in the beginning of a project with something else than stakeholder mapping. Well, as I said in the beginning, it's kind of my risk management strategy, because it allows me to, throughout the project, have a way of looking at risk with stakeholders and influencers on the project, even if I personally really would like to spend my time with something else. But it is such an important part of any project or any work.
And when you say, keep them informed, different sectors you said have different strategies. I mean, what all have you adopted and what all can we adopt? What all are the different ways in which we can engage with them?
It's informing can be just by publishing. For example, we publish blog posts within, even if it's a big project, throughout the project, sharing that, making certain, even just sharing it over an email and saying like, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, is just keeping them informed where things stand, and then hearing back from them if they, at least they're part of the process. Because I think the ones there, the keeping informed ones, if you don't keep them informed, because they still have an eye, they might not be influential, but it's not just about being influential. It's about, a lot of time, they're the ones who are the direct and indirect stakeholders who are going to reap the most benefits out of it. Because they might not, like a local community, a member in a local community might not be the most influential person in your stakeholder map. However, they're highly interested by the outcomes because it might touch their lives. So not keeping them informed, you risk, or you're like, they'll run the risk, then when the time comes to do something with the data, to put the data into action, that they will say like, no, I'm not going to do that. I have not been consulted. I have not been informed. And it's possibly right that they say that, because they have not been consulted. And then, you're there, the project is almost finished and the outcomes are there. And just by the fact that you didn't keep them informed, will have a huge impact on the outcome of the project. And I've seen in so many projects that I've done, so you go and map with local communities. And okay, you do community engagement, you might go there once or twice or 3 times. So you already informed them in the beginning. But what is really important for some of the longer term projects I work with is that you come back in between. Or if you don't come back because it's a faraway place that, asks of days of travel, then find a number of kind of key contacts in the community and just share with them where you stand. We just finalized processing the data and have created our first outcomes. We will come back in 3 months for the next phase of mapping. When we come back, we will bring back, the first outcomes and maps. Can we organize for that? So just keeping open that communication, and it has made such a difference. I worked in several projects in Africa, and I remember vividly one project where the community was so surprised that we would keep them informed even when we were not there. And it made a huge difference, because when it came back, they had highly interesting questions. They provided us with so much local information and contextual information that made our data analysis much better, because they also had to prepare. They knew we were coming back. We brought back first results that were not the final results, so they can understand, where do we want to go with this. And then they started sharing so much information with us. That made the project outcomes much more valuable than if we wouldn't have had this information. And it has been by just keeping that dialogue open and keeping them informed. It just, and if you think about it, it's just a matter of courtesy, just a matter of respect. And it doesn't need that much. It's not something that takes time. It will take, half an hour to send out some emails or to share, to write something up and share it with people. It's not a big effort when you look at sometimes, a big project. In the end, it's not going to make a big difference in time, but it's going to make a huge difference in outcomes. And it's at the end, it's going to make a huge difference, a lot of time to the beneficiaries.
Thank you, Sonja. So we had a hand raise from Sumit. Sumit, do you want to raise your question?
Yeah, hi, Dr. Ruchi. Hi, Sonja. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, and it's very informative. So I just need, like, if you can explain the different kind of stakeholders. I mean to say, like, with an example. So, like, that would be more informative and helpful. That's it. Thank
Okay, thank you, Sumit. Let me take my little map here. So to just kind of, if I look at a project I did, like one of the most latest projects possibly, if I would take, my quadrant and say who were like the high influential and high interest stakeholders, it definitely is, first of all, is the client. And the client is not always, in the social good projects, not always the client who actually will pay for the project. It might be a donor paying for the project or a government, and the client might actually be a local government. So I've done a project where the client was the local government, but it was the national government who paid for it together with an international donor. So they were, for us, the most important stakeholders. So again, the client, the local government, the national government who actually paid for it, and the donor. And then we were not the only ones in that project. So drone data was only part of it. We also gathered ground data. So all the collaborators, the project collaborators that were not part of the flying labs, but also gathered different data sources for that, we made them also part of our stakeholders, and of actually the most important stakeholders, because not sharing with them all the time what we were doing and getting from them information where they were standing would have put the project at risk. So our high influence, high interest stakeholders, because influence, is not only in terms of influence on the outcomes, it's also influence on the project. If you're not talking to the other project kind of partners that were doing the ground data acquisition, that can have like a quite serious influence on the technical outcome of our project. So these were our high interest, high influence, stakeholders. Then the high influence, kind of low interest stakeholders was other governments and communities close to it, because they will have a high influence on the outcome, on the adoption also of this project. So while the local government that was part of the project was in the right upper corner, in the left upper corner, we had the ones who were close by. Because we already knew by talking to the national government that, this pilot project, if it works out great, then it will be also deployed in the areas around. So already having them there, it's going to be a high influence, to go for the further steps. So we made them part of our stakeholders on the low interest, because it was not for them. They were not really interested. It's a neighboring community, so this is not something for us. But thinking ahead and knowing, they're going to be next, it's like, let's them already put them here and let's keep them satisfied. Let's involve them. Let's also ask them if this would be your community, what would be important for you. It gives a different point of view also, and it allowed us to already plan for the future. Then, like I said before, on the high interest but low influence kind of part, it was the members of the community, because it was their council and their local governments who were the clients. But in the end, I would say the beneficiaries, or even the ones, it's not always just beneficial, it's also the outcomes will heavily influence the local community members. So for us, in the lower right corner, in the high interest and low influence corner, we had mostly community members. We had also local NGOs who are working there because they're already doing work in this area. So they are not influential per se to the project, but they're going to be highly interested by the outcomes because it will influence their work. So again, they don't have a direct influence on the project and the outcomes and the decisions that will be taken by the local government. However, in the future, they will be influenced by the outcomes. And for them, just as a courtesy to keep them updated and informed from the very beginning so they can understand and be part of the process, made a big difference. And then in kind of the low interest and low influence area, we just had listed a number of players in the country. It was not really difficult for us to get the flight permissions. This was not something of interest. So the Civil Aviation Authority, for example, fell in that low interest and low influence corner because it was very easy to get the flight permissions. In this country, the regulations are very clear. So sometimes, it's these kind of stakeholders like the Civil Aviation Authorities or Homeland Security, they might say, no interest here, but they might have much influence. So depending on your environment, these kind of stakeholders that are in many ways completely unrelated to the project, but still part of it, you will always have them kind in the low interest area, but possibly the lower bottom, because it's quite a straightforward process to get your permissions, or if it's very difficult, you'll have them more on the higher side, on the keep satisfied side. Does this help, Sumit?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much for explaining so greatly. It really helped. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sumit.
Sonia, we have a question. Do you make different types of proposals, keeping in mind different stakeholders' interest type? Like some of them are focusing on a short-time benefit and also considering a project unrealistic for becoming not enough optimistic. Sometimes we also don't have enough real-time data that also lead us to failure. I think your map can help us.
That's a very interesting point. So what we try to do is, sometimes it's long projects, but it's to cut them up in very distinctive phases. So to always have kind of a proof of concept phase where we can test it out, in this phase is also we learn a lot about stakeholders. We learn about the ones we missed a lot of times, actually, because we always miss stakeholders. You kind of think you have a good list, but then there's always ones that you forget about. So to work in kind of small steps and in a very agile way, and going with possibly a first small proof of concept phase in projects helps to address that. It helps to, it also helps to create first successes and first outcomes then to share with stakeholders. Because a lot of time for stakeholders, if they have never been involved in a drone or drone data project, I get, talked about expectations. Oh my God, people might have very, very different expectations. Huh? So for them to be able to already see first outcomes quite fast helps then for the dialogue and for the discussion to prepare for the next phases. So it's definitely a good idea to kind of cut that up in parts and trying to do, a simulation, or if it's just a demo or just, small engagements in the very beginning for the people to kind of help them imagine what will come out of it, share examples possibly that might have been elsewhere already applied for the kind of same use case, will help the stakeholders to kind of get on board. So I have an example. We worked in Tanzania on land management, and the local government, who was actually the client, it was in their interest to have certificates, land certificates for farmers. Now, their understanding was, a drone would fly and the drone would output the land certificate. They're like, no. See, this is not what's going to happen. So the drone will fly, it will acquire, photographs. These photographs will allow to make a map. Now the map, we can produce different formats for you, but then the next steps, is not going to be part of the project. Then, so that also had a second part where then they engaged the second team who did boundary information on the ground. But then we said to the local government, like, creating certificates for the farmers, it's not going to be your job. That's the government's job. That's not the drone's job. The drone will not kind of print out a certificate, for the local farmer. So it's to show, how misaligned sometimes expectations can be. And this is like, oh, this is very disappointing. We thought, we have heard about drones being able to produce land certificates. So for them, the interpretation of drones producing land certificates means the drone kind of spits out the land certificate. You're like, yeah, no, it's not that simple. But it just shows, how then imagine, you don't engage that in the very beginning and ask. And so we did a demo and show them, what is going to happen throughout the project. It's a big area, it's a big project. And so we did just a very small little village. And then said, okay, yeah, we need to bring in other people. Now that we see this, so we need to bring in this office. Oh, what is this office doing? Oh, they're the ones who register, the land. And then we need to bring in this office also. So we learned a lot on the way that we actually did not know. And the government also, for them, imagine, we would just have everybody knows what you're talking about and not taking that in small steps. And then in the end, spend 3 months, give them maps, highly, interesting maps of all their villages in their whole local government. And they would say, like, where are the certificates? Well, no, this is your job. This would have been a catastrophe. So that's why. And in so many ways, I have done projects where we do just that. We ask the client what they want, and we kind of get lost in translation, what we mean by the drone will create land certificates. And we all think we talk about the same thing because the client came to us to say, can you help with drones for land certificates? Yes, we can. So it's kind of being lost in translation. So to not do these small steps in between and looking at each step and making sure that we have a very good stakeholder management would have been a catastrophe.
Thank you, Sonia. I think we'll take this last question. In a project which includes multiple stakeholders, which do you prefer, a top-down or a bottom-to-top approach, like the national government, state, or the local to the local people, or the other way around?
It's a really good question. I'm a bottom-up person because that's what's kind of my DNA is always and has always been bottom-up, and it just brought me in much trouble in my professional life to have like a bottom-up spirit. So I learned through that you possibly need to do both. A lot of people just do the top-down. I don't believe in the top-down approach because I think it's very traditional. But it doesn't bring good outcomes because it does not include who is, at the bottom, and it's mostly the people. If you're honest, like the final decision always comes down to the people at the bottom. If somebody does not want to accept what's being presented, you're not going to change their mind, and that's actually a really good thing. So I always have been a kind of a radical bottom-up person, but I have run into much trouble with this. So I had to learn kind of blending both in, or kind of still sticking to my bottom-up approach because that's what lays very close to my heart, but then also kind of engage simultaneously in a top-down approach and learn from that side and just take that to add on. And that's what I kind of learned, the top-down, a lot of time it's just about keeping them informed and keeping them satisfied. They might actually not have that much interest, they're influential, but they don't have that much interest in what comes out. Or it might be very personal interests that have nothing to do with the project. So keeping them satisfied is actually a lot of times not that difficult. However, where I lay my most focus on is the bottom up, because it is the kind of approach that is mostly not done, that most organizations or most projects don't do. Is always kind of a top-down approach. I don't believe in it. And from experience, I also have seen so many projects who have failed because they're top-down projects.
Thank you so much, Sonia. This was a really amazing session. And I hope our students who are right now in the live class, as well as the ones who would be watching this video later on, would definitely benefit from this learning. And hopefully we all will be applying this learning to our real life projects, not just with drones, but with any technology which is still out there and still in the imaginary world. And we are still trying to get a grasp of what exactly this does and where exactly we are getting influenced by it. And we have no idea, like imagine drones just flying over your head tomorrow in swarms and swarms, and we have no control over them and we don't even know who controls them. So this is the kind of scenario where we would need this learning a lot more, wherein we need to get back to people, we need to talk to them, we need to keep them engaged, informed, and take the consent, take them into a project, and then take it forward. So yes, lead, but lead with a good purpose. So with this, we would come to an end. And I once again thank you, Sonja, for your generous sharing of your knowledge and experience and your story with us. And once again, thank you for being a part of our course.
Thank you for inviting me, Ruchi. It has been a pleasure. Do you want to share the
assignments?
Yeah, the assignment with the group also.
Oh, yes. So everyone, we have an interesting assignment which Sonja has shared with us. Sonja, you can share it at your end. And this is going to be...
Let me just share it from my side.
Yes, please.
There it is.
So it's a direct homework of what you have learned today.
Yes. So the assignment for you is to think about either possibly you have a project on the way, or you're planning a project, or you dream about the project you want to do, or you work on something right now that might turn into a project. I would like to have you think about creating your stakeholder map and strategy. So to say, like, to choose an activity of your work or a project, and to then start creating a stakeholder map and creating the engagement strategy. So coming back to the 3 points you've seen before, which were these 3, to say, create a list of the stakeholders, create a map based on their characteristics, and the map can be something like this, in this format, and then create that strategy for engagement. Just on a theoretical point, I think doing it once, you will see it's actually quite interesting exercise. It takes time, but it's a very interesting exercise. And the more you kind of train yourself with kind of any, methodology or any method, it comes very second nature after a while. So starting somewhere and doing one to start out with a very clear project that you would love to do, or that you dream about, or that you're actually doing, is going to be a great first step.
Thank you so much, Sonja. And can we request you to also share this PowerPoint with us so that we can revise it when we're doing the assignments?
Exactly. So I'll do that. I'll send you the PDF with all of that. And I actually have if of interest, I actually have a 3-page PDF document, not just the slides, but with also the information that I've shared, which might be of interest to you. So I also can share that.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sonja. So let's bid a goodbye to Sonja, and I request rest of you to stay back in the meeting. We have something more to discuss.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone. Have a good session.
Bye, Sonja.
Thank you, Sonja, ma'am.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, so Sonja had another session to go on. Can we have our videos on? I'll just pause the recording.